This process is going to be quick, relatively easy, and totally not different at all from stretching any other sheet of paper over a wood panel. So let's get straight into the materials, and then I'm going to do a demonstration of how to stretch this paper over a panel. First things first, I've got my cradled panel. Now this is a birch panel. You can see there's a little birch veneer on the top, and I've also got about a 1-inch deep cradle on the back of it. I choose a cradled panel specifically because if you have something a little bit less substantial, it risks with water to actually warp the wood, and I like the possibility to leave my painting on the panel for framing. After that, I've got my white sheet of Stonehenge oil paper. I've cut it to size to fit around the panel. So before we go to stretch this, we want to make sure that we have at least 1.5 inches to 2 inches of paper on each side of the panel so that you have enough room to actually stretch the paper around the back of the cradle. From there, I've got my light duty staple gun. Really, just about any light duty staple gun will do. The only advice I have about staple guns really is actually about the staples you fill them with. The staples that I've chosen for this are actually rather shallow. There are a lot deeper versions that you can get, but a lot of times what happens when you're working with a light duty staple gun is you'll go to staple into the side of the panel and the staple won't go all the way in. Some of this has to do with actually the length of the staple you're choosing, so more shallow staples are a little bit better in my experience. Then, last but not least, we've got a little jar of water, just plain old H2O, nothing special about it, and I'm gonna use that to soak the paper. Also, you're gonna notice underneath all these materials, there's a little plastic sheet that I've taped onto the top of my wooden table. This is just to keep the table safe from water damage. Now, let's get everything out of the way, and I'm gonna start the demonstration. Once I start this process, I'm not gonna have a lot of opportunity to stop because it's somewhat time sensitive. So I'm going to describe in brief beforehand what I'm going to do. I'm gonna open up my jar of water, pour it onto the surface of the paper, spread it around with my hand, top to bottom, side to side, evenly. And then I'm gonna flip the paper over and do the exact same thing on the other side. After that, I'm gonna allow the paper to soak for maybe 1 or 2 minutes. With time and practice, you're gonna get to know the personality of your paper and how long you need to let it soak in order to ensure that when it dries over the panel that you get a nice drum-tight surface. I can say that while I'm doing this, you don't want to rub the paper too hard. Really, all you're doing is spreading the water over the surface to make sure that it contacts every area of the surface. That way you don't have any dry spots in the middle of your paper. If I were to really rub it too hard, I would risk, while the paper is wet, to actually pull up some of the fibers and lose a little bit the integrity of the surface. So let's wait a couple minutes while the water penetrates into the fibers of the paper. Right before I start to attach the paper to the panel, there's something worth mentioning. I call this stretching paper because the paper expands when it's wet and contracts when it's dry, thus stretching it over the top of the panel. That doesn't mean, however, that when I'm attaching the actual paper to the panel, that I'm going to be pulling on it. At this moment, the paper is at its most vulnerable. The water has seeped into it and made it very, very soft, and so I'm really just going to be gently folding it over the back and stapling it onto that surface. No stretching required. Now, depending upon the size of panel that you're stretching, you might have a couple different options. With a panel that's this small, I actually don't want to start by stapling. I want to start by folding in my corners. Now, the corners are the most vulnerable part of the stretch, and so I want to get a little pre-fold happening on them so that when I staple here, I don't have a little bit of tension at the edge here that makes it difficult for me to fold those corners in. Now, I used to be a lot more particular about this in the past, but really I find kind of a double fold system is best, just so you get a couple of flat edges on either side of it. Now that I've gotten those corners in place, I'm going to put a staple in the middle of 2 sides. Nothing too complicated to do now. I just want to make sure I get all 4 sides covered in staples. I'm going to leave maybe 1.5 inches, 2-inch gap in between staples. Now that that's done, I'm going to remove this for a moment. I'm going to take a towel and wipe up whatever excess water. I'm going to flip this over and let it dry. Depending upon the climate in your studio or house, you're going to find that it takes anywhere between 30 minutes to an hour to fully dry. So if we've done our job the right way, what I should have here is a nice, tight, flat, stretched piece of paper over this cradled panel. You can see here that all the waviness from when it was wet is totally gone. and the parts of the paper that are around the back of the panel are also nice and dry and tightened. This particular panel I could probably let go for another hour before it was totally as tight as it could get, but for the purposes of this demonstration, this is about as far as we need to go. This process will work on most any size paper that you want to stretch. I personally have only stretched up to 16 by 20 inches, but I could see 18 by 24 or even a little bit larger than that being no problem at all. So now that we've stretched up this oil paper over this panel, I just want to talk a little bit about how it's going to perform when you start putting oil paint onto it. Now, before I start any alla prima painting that I'm going to do, I like to make a little pre-sketch. Because the surface of the oil paper is so soft though, I don't like to use a graphite pencil because I feel like that would start to dent the surface in ways that you would actually see after the painted surface had gone on top of it. So I like to use a colored pencil, like a teal or a black colored pencil. You can use magenta, whatever color, it doesn't really matter. Now the next step that we go through, of course, is just getting the oil paint onto the surface. In an alla prima painting, you want to do it fast. You want to block in the whole context of color and value so you can start to work out some of the finer points of the design. And this is where you'll find the most divergent performance in this material if you're used to working on an oil ground, for instance. This oil paper is very absorbent, and so getting the whole painting blocked in is going to be a little bit of a laborious process. It's not going to slide slickly across the surface like it would if you had a relatively non-absorbent substrate. Now, after that slight uphill battle in getting the block in established, this is where the paper starts to pay you off. That same absorbency that made it a little bit slow to block in with now turns into something that grabs onto your paintbrush really well, meaning that you can get beautiful soft gradations and transitions in between the color values that you put on the surface. Bottom line here is a little bit tough to block in, but really easy to finish. And that is a trade that I would make every day of the week. Thank you so much for watching, and I hope that you try this process in your own studio. Remember that you can always find me at Stephen Bauman Artwork on Patreon, YouTube, and Instagram.